Hello again. Professor Richard Calland says President Cyril Ramaphosa went from being a robust and resolute trade union man to being a risk-averse president. He's detailing this in his new book, The Presidents from Mandela to Ramaphosa, Leadership in the Age of Crisis, which he co-authored with Mabel Sithole. What do they believe could be the reason, for example, that Ramaphosa's leadership character or style appears now to be at odds with the resolute and courageous leadership which he demonstrated as a trade union leader way back in the 1980s? Well, Professor Calland joins me now to enlighten us further. Prof, good afternoon. Welcome to Today on ENCA. Thank you very much for your time. Just an overriding question first. Why this book at this time? I mean, I like the title. It talks about leadership in the age of crisis. Is that why?
Yes, there are two or three reasons why we were eager to get this book out at this time. First of all, the way we position this book is that we are, as a human species, living through the age of crisis. There are multiple layers to that crisis, ranging from the climate crisis through to the social and economic crisis and predicaments that we see in many places, worsened, of course, by the COVID pandemic. Part of that global crisis, we argue, is a crisis in leadership, particularly in political leadership. And so we wanted to examine what sort of political leadership, presidential leadership, is needed during an age of crisis such as this. And our aperture for this is to look at through the lens of presidential leadership in this country since 1994. And there are 5 very interesting presidents that we've had, all from one party, but all very different in terms of their style, their character, their decision-making tempo, and their strategic approach or lack of strategic approach. And so it's 5 case studies. And of course, the 5th one is Ramaphosa himself, the current president. And of course, in 1 month's time or so, he will face yet another test of his winning prowess when he must try and win re-election at the ANC conference in December.
Yeah, hence it's such a topical matter to discuss. Yes, you start with Mandela, you go to Mbeki, you go to Zuma, and for a short stint to Motlanthe. But the man of the moment is, of course, Ramaphosa. Has he really changed?
Well, it may be that underneath it all, his core character and his core approach to politics and ideology may not have changed that much. I suspect he's still what I would call broadly a social democrat. I think he believes in a sort of corporatist approach to problem solving. By that, I mean that he likes to get the main economic and political actors around a table, locked into a process. He likes to consult, and he likes to try and forge consensus. I think that is a good way of leading oftentimes, but at a time of crisis where there is great urgency, where the stakes are very high, a faster tempo, I think, is needed, and more decisiveness and probably more risk-taking. And what was so interesting for us as we talked to a range of sources and people that have known him for a long time was to see how his way of leading, his character, appeared on the surface at least to have changed. And we explore that in the book, and it's, I think, really interesting to see how someone with such a long political career has adopted different kinds of strategy and tactics throughout different phases of his career. And of course, his current approach is attracting criticism because it said he's not decisive enough, he's not bold enough. And yet, when one looks back to the 80s, those were characteristics that shone out. This was a man who was very brave, who stood up to power, who was very resolute in his negotiating. And people who worked with him closely at that time, we quote, and they tell us stories about how he led as a trade union leader in the 80s.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering here, I don't know if it's something to bring up, but when we are all young, we tend to be more adventurous and militant. I mean, when he was General Secretary, he was elected the General Secretary, founding General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers. At the time, in the 80s, it was the largest trade union on the African continent, and he was young and militant and surrounded by similar-minded comrades. But when you are sitting at union buildings, most times you tend to be alone. It can be very hard to lead when you are alone.
You make a very good point, Dan, and I'm grateful for it. And I think it does help us at least explain, if not, or at least understand and explain, if not justify his approach now Because you're right, when you're representing a trade union in a negotiation, in a time of conflict and crisis, you have one set of goals. You're representing, as it were, one set of interests. Now that he's president, his duty, his constitutional obligation is to govern for all of us and to govern in a way that finds and navigates a path through competing interests. And that's complex and difficult. And there's a couple of our sources, including Rolf Mayer, who got to know him very well during those constitutional negotiations in the early 90s. The way he put it to us was that exactly that when you are a negotiator representing, for example, COSATU or the National Union of Mine Workers or even the ANC, you have a body of people around you, as you put it down. You have an organization to engage with and to represent. When you're the president, it is lonelier. You are ultimately the repository of power. The buck stops with you. And I think that has perhaps made him less more risk averse, made him less courageous. He treads very carefully and very cautiously. He tries to build support before he moves ahead.
Okay, finally, and very brief, if you may, Prof, and I don't want to assume people have read your opinion piece about it, which I have. I just want you to share with our viewers the experience you had sitting there at the 54th National Conference of the ANC in Nasrec in December 2017, right there in front, and your eyes locked with those of President Ramaphosa after he was announced as the new president of the ANC. What did you see?
Well, thank you for bringing back that extraordinary day. Of course, it was a key moment, a defining moment in this man's political career, in his life. He'd worked hard for it, and I think he'd made sacrifices by deciding to be the running mate of Jacob Zuma in 2012. He took a big risk, actually, and it shows, interestingly, that this is a man who is capable of risks, taking risks at certain times in order to pursue certain objectives. And he did that, and it paid off that day when he had his narrow victory at Nasrec in 2017. As you'll recall, Dan, security was tremendously tight in that conference. There was an attempt to really control and regulate media coverage. But somehow I found myself, along with some other journalists like Sam Kokele, your colleague, and others, at the very, very front of the hall and sitting just a few meters away from Cyril Ramaphosa as he awaited the outcome. It was clear that he got some kind of message just seconds before the announcement, and you could see his face showing relief and even a degree of joy. And then the announcement of the result, and you could see that sense of history, that sense of redemption, that it was all worth it, that he had finally reached the summit of political career ambitions. But then, of course, that was just the start. It got harder and harder, and governing with power is extremely difficult in an age of crisis. And he's made mistakes and perhaps hasn't acquitted himself as well as he should have done.
Yeah, we're going to have to wait and see what this conference will bring for the man come December this year for the 55th election conference of the ANC. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Calland. He has co-authored a book with Mabel Sithole entitled The Presidents from Mandela to Ramaphosa, Leadership in the Age of Crisis. And he argues that the leadership style of Ramaphosa has changed from being resolute, decisive and courageous when he was a trade unionist in the 80s to now being more consultative, taking a long time to take decisions at the union buildings as the President of the Republic.